Male brutality sometimes knows no bounds and can shock even the most resilient people. This dark side of human nature, unfortunately, has existed as long as humanity itself. How many times have we heard about horrific crimes that make our blood run cold? How many times have we thought that such things can only happen in movies or in some distant, unknown places? But reality sometimes turns out to be much scarier than any fiction. Today's story will tell about a woman who died a martyr's death in the flames due to the betrayal of a close person. This is not another urban legend or a plot of a thriller. This is a real story that happened to real people. A story that makes you shudder with horror and think about what a person is capable of. But at the same time, it is also a story about the strength of the spirit, about the fight for justice, and about the fact that even the most terrible crimes cannot go unpunished. Kimberly Antonakos, the only child in the family, was born in 1974 in New York, USA. Her father, Thomas, was a successful businessman who, at the beginning of his career, was engaged in real estate, and after the birth of his daughter, switched to the promising computer industry. The family had enough money, and the loving father willingly spent it on the whims of his child. When Kimberly was only 1 year old, her parents divorced, and the girl stayed with her mother, communicating with her father only on weekends. Thomas greatly valued these short moments when he could take his daughter to his place and spend free time with her. A few years later, Kimberly's mother decided to move to Florida, having found a new man with whom she wanted to build a family. Kimberly decided to stay in New York, where she grew up, and began to live with her father, with whom they had a truly close relationship. The daughter even jokingly asked her father not to marry again, so that there would be no negative changes in their relationship. At the age of 20, Kimberly was studying at Staten Island College and was known as a bright, kind, and cheerful young beauty. Her parents had surrounded her with care since childhood, solving all her problems for her. So the dark side of the world and people bypassed the young girl, leaving her open, sociable, and a little naive. In 1994, Kimberly wanted to move to her own apartment. Her father was initially against it, worrying about his daughter's safety, but he understood that she needed to become independent and build her own life. In the end, he agreed and helped choose housing in a safe area of the city, purchased a place in a garage across the street for her car, and gave her a mobile phone, which at that time was a rarity and an expensive pleasure. Thomas even bought his daughter a pit bull puppy, hoping that with him she would feel calmer, and in the future, the dog would be able to protect Kimberly. The father had reason to worry because for many years he had protected his daughter and had repeatedly witnessed her unsuccessful choice of guys who offended her. Thomas repeatedly offered Kimberly to return home or work in the family business, but she refused, wanting to find her own way in life. The father never pressured his daughter and wanted to give her freedom of choice. Kimberly lived a typical student life with parties and entertainment, not suspecting what a cruel denouement awaited her. Recently, she got a part-time job as an accountant, but the people Kimberly trusted turned out to be real traitors. On February 28, 1995, Kim went to another party with her friend Liz, where the girls danced and had fun. The next day, March 1st, Kimberly was supposed to go to work, but her colleagues were met with her absence. The worried manager called the girl's father, hoping that she was just sick and could not contact the office. However, Thomas began to panic because he had not heard from his daughter since the night of February 28th. The man tried to contact Kimberly and her friends, but no one had seen her since she left the party early in the morning of March 1st. The alarmed father decided not to wait and immediately turned to the police, but received a standard answer. Responding to Thomas's appeal, law enforcement officers noted that they were talking about a young person who had disappeared after a party and who, by law, was already considered an adult and had the right to make independent decisions. They suggested that Kimberly might have stayed with friends and would return home soon. For Kimberly to be officially declared missing, at least 24 hours had to pass from the moment of her disappearance. Such an answer, of course, did not satisfy Kimberly's father. He decided to organize a search party on his own, involving the girl's friends. First of all, they headed to the parking lot near Kimberly's apartment. Everything indicated that after the party, she had not returned here. In her parking space, there was no 1994 Honda Accord, a gift from a loving dad. Kimberly was also not found in her apartment. Armed with these facts, Thomas visited the police station again, insisting that something bad had happened to his daughter. But the law enforcement officers were adamant. Instead, the worried father continued his own investigation. He visited places where Kimberly could be, talked to numerous people. He was particularly persistent in trying to enlist the support of law enforcement. And finally, he was lucky. One of the detectives became interested in the mysterious disappearance of the businessman's daughter. Like Thomas, he immediately felt that something was wrong here. Despite the protocol, the investigator emphasized the urgency of the actions and personally undertook to help the father of the missing girl. First of all, the detective had to reject the version about Kimberly running away from home. He carefully analyzed the transactions on Kimberly's bank card. She had not used it since the evening before her disappearance. The investigator contacted all the friends of the missing girl, but none of them had seen her after that evening and did not know about her whereabouts. Next, the policeman set about reconstructing Kimberly's schedule the day before her disappearance, hoping to stumble upon some clues. Soon it was possible to find out that on the morning of February 28th, Kimberly, as always, attended classes at the college. After studying, she went to work, where she spent several hours. Then Kimberly contacted her faithful companion at all parties, Liz Pace. Together, the girlfriends went to another party where they had fun and drank a little. Around 4 a.m, they decided it was time to go to their homes. In Kimberly's car, the girls reached Liz's house, located a few blocks from Kimberly's apartment. Liz headed to her place, and her friend drove off in her own direction. Since then, Liz has not seen her again. So, it became known that Kimberly got behind the wheel while intoxicated. Despite this, it was extremely important to understand what happened to her after she dropped off Liz and headed to her parking space. Where could she have gone? To find out, the detective went to the missing girl's house. Examining the territory of the garage, the investigator was looking for at least some traces or signs that could lead to a solution. Joshua, Kimberly's neighbor, said that he began calling all her friends and acquaintances as soon as Kimberly did not return home on time. According to him, he treated the student like a younger sister, so he looked after her and was very worried about her disappearance. Kimberly's mother was informed about her daughter's disappearance the very next day. The woman immediately flew in from Florida. She settled in her daughter's apartment, and the family that sheltered the mother of the missing girl invited her to their place. Kimberly's loved ones continued to be considered as suspects. The girl's mother took an active part in her search. Once a friend advised her to turn to a psychic who might be able to shed light on Kimberly's fate. In despair, the woman grasped at this idea. Visiting the clairvoyant, she showed a photo of her daughter and begged for help. The seer assured that Kimberly was alive, but in serious danger, so there was no time to delay the search. According to him, the girl was exhausted, dehydrated, and very cold. The psychic reported that Kimberly was kidnapped by people she knew. She tried to escape, but they caught her again and tied her up. The seer kept repeating that he saw the letter J in the name of one of the culprits, probably the main instigator of what happened. He considered the kidnapper to be a young man whose name began with this letter. The missing girl's mother passed this information on to the police. In fact, this was the only information that the detectives had at that time, so they decided to use this clue. Referring to the psychic, law enforcement made this data public. The very next day, this was widely trumpeted by the New York News, causing quite a stir in society. And soon there was a new twist in the case. On March 4th, around 2 o'clock in the night, a strong fire broke out on 86th Avenue in Ozone Park, Queens. Later, one of the eyewitnesses of the event said that shortly before the fire, he was walking with his dog. It was near that house that the animal behaved extremely restlessly and barked at it for a long time. Despite the outwardly calm atmosphere on the territory, it was an ordinary abandoned building. But the considerable size of the structure attracted attention, and several fire brigades had to be involved to fight the fire. When the flames finally died down, police officers and firefighters set about searching the ashes. Everything indicated that no one really lived here. However, a gruesome find awaited them in the basement. A charred corpse was found at the bottom. The remains were so badly mutilated by the fire that it seemed difficult even to determine the gender of the deceased. It was assumed that it was a woman because long dark hair was preserved. But the most terrible thing was that the deceased was tied to a chair. Forensic experts confirmed the victim's arms and legs were fixed. She was not wearing shoes, and her wrists remained tied behind her back even after death. Without a doubt, it was murder. It was established that at the time the fire started, the victim was still alive. Her lungs were filled with smoke, which means she was burned alive. The investigation showed that some criminal doused the premises of the house with a flammable liquid and then set it on fire. Due to the terrible condition of the body, it was extremely difficult to identify the victim. The police hoped that the deceased was the missing Kimberly. Dental records were needed for identification of the remains. To obtain them, the detective turned to the father of the missing girl and shared his guesses. During the investigation, the forensic experts were able to detect a tattoo on the deceased similar to the one Kimberly had, and also confirmed the suspicions using dental charts. All this made it possible to confirm the detectives' gruesome guesses. The police tried to collect fingerprints in the garage where the victim's car was supposed to be and at the fire scene. However, the forensic experts were unable to do this. There were simply no traces. They were either carefully wiped away or the kidnapper was wearing gloves. Now it became clear why the neighbor's dog had been constantly stopping near this house and behaving restlessly in recent days. Kimberly was desperately trying to free herself, calling for help, so she was making noise. The animal heard her, but these sounds remained inaccessible to the human ear. Law enforcement officers immediately contacted the owner of the burned-down house. Vyacheslav was shocked by the event. He had long put the building up for sale and did not visit it himself. From time to time, his assistants came here to check the condition of the structure. They briefly inspected the doors and windows to make sure everything was okay, and also picked up the mail. During those days when Kimberly was being held in the basement, he also appeared here. Usually, he examined the house from the outside, took letters and bills, and then just left. Being outside, with the city noise, he could not hear Kimberly, who might have been crying for help at that very moment. He only had to go down to the basement, and he would have immediately discovered something was wrong. Unfortunately, the man did not do this. Kimberly was one step away from salvation, but it did not help. Given that all possible evidence was burned, the victim's family and the police were again forced to turn to the psychic. This time, the clairvoyant reported that she saw 4 people involved in the massacre. She again repeated that the name of one of them began with the letter J, but the seer's testimony alone was not enough to detain the killer. The victim's father announced a reward of $10,000 for any information that would help catch the murderer. The police continued the investigation and found out that on the day of his daughter's disappearance, when the father returned home, he listened to the messages on the answering machine. Among them were 2 strange calls when there was silence on the other end of the line. Later, they played an important role in this case. In the meantime, investigators assumed that it could be Kimberly trying to contact her father, or the criminals wanted to call him to demand a ransom, but something prevented them from doing so. Perhaps there were problems with communication. When the public learned about this, various rumors began to spread. People accused even the victim's father, Thomas, believing that he was the one to blame for his daughter's death. Some claimed that this wealthy businessman had ties to the local mafia. The police checked this information, despite the entrepreneur's objections. It was possible to prove that he was really not connected with the criminal world. Soon Kim's car was found. For several days, the vehicle stood on one of the quiet streets of the city, quite far from the fire scene. The residents did not know that the car was wanted, since no one officially announced it. But since the car stood there for almost a week and no one knew its owner, the locals sounded the alarm. When the detectives arrived at the scene and examined the interior and trunk of the car, they found Kimberly's second gold earring there. Hair and fingerprints were also found, but after that, the investigation stalled for a long 6 months. On September 6, 1995, new witnesses appeared. A man and a woman turned to the police. The couple stated that their mutual friend boasted about the massacre of Kimberly. They told about 22-year-old Joshua Torres, the same young man whom Kimberly sheltered with his family. After that, the detectives met with him again and decided to ask a few questions. Joshua said that on the morning of Kimberly's disappearance, he called many of her friends. The only one who did not answer the call was a Russian guy nicknamed Psycho, one of Kimberly's ex-boyfriends. According to Joshua, the apartment owner was afraid of this guy. In addition, the guy informed the police that on the day of Kimberly's disappearance, he saw a company of suspicious Russians driving through their area in a car. Upon learning this, Thomas decided to continue his own investigation. He went to the address where that guy lived to talk to him face to face. But the young man was not there. Instead, the man managed to meet with the youngster's neighbors. Everyone in the district claimed that he was a rather unpleasant guy who had little contact with others. But no one could help find him. Only the next day, Thomas managed to intercept the guy and persuade him to visit the police station to give evidence. There, the detectives noticed a tattoo on his leg with the abbreviation Kim, which was probably made during his relationship with the victim of the crime. However, the young man assured that the tattoo was dedicated to his close childhood friend. After a short interrogation, the detectives found nothing suspicious. The guy denied his involvement in Kimberly's murder, and his solid alibi was confirmed. Investigators made sure that he had nothing to do with the crime. Police officers analyzed the calls made from Kimberly's home on the morning of her disappearance. It turned out that Joshua had lied. He claimed that he was calling Kimberly's friends and acquaintances, but it turned out that most of the numbers belonged to random women. Then the detectives demanded access to the young man's pager. At that time in the USA, they were widely distributed and used instead of mobile phones. It became known that on that fateful morning, Joshua sent several suspicious messages while in the apartment of the missing girl. The guy assured that he was just communicating with friends and gave evasive comments. Joshua's behavior aroused more and more suspicion. By the way, his name began with the letter J, the very one that the psychic, whom the victim's mother turned to, constantly insisted on. Having studied the details about him, the investigators found out that the young man was not working anywhere. He lived at the expense of his cohabitant and looked after the child while she was at work. All this made him the perfect candidate for the role of the kidnapper. Having a lot of free time, he could calmly plan the crime, track the victim, and take her to an abandoned house to demand a ransom. However, something went wrong, and the criminal was forced to hastily destroy all the evidence. Together with Kimberly, detectives told Joshua that they no longer considered Kimberly's former Russian boyfriend a suspect in this case. They put pressure on him, and the guys started talking. Joshua immediately began to tell a new story. He suspected that his friends might have been involved in what happened. The case involved 3 men who grabbed Kimberly in the parking lot and stuffed her into the trunk. The first one turned out to be Julio Negrin. Acquaintances confirmed that he had recently been dating Kimberly and even wanted to marry her. However, the girl was not interested in such a relationship, and the couple broke up. Under pressure from the police, Julio confessed to complicity and kidnapping. According to him, he did not know that they were going to kill Kimberly. The kidnappers only wanted to get a ransom because they needed money, and they intended to let the victim go. But the plan failed. The police's suspicions were confirmed quite quickly. The suspect's cohabitant, April, recalled that on the day Kimberly was declared missing, Joshua was watching TV with his friends. When the news began to broadcast information about a suspect whose name began with the letter J, one of them jumped up and quickly left, dragging the others with him. This man was 19-year-old Nicholas Liberty, nicknamed Jay. Later that same day, the body of the missing girl was found in the basement of the burned-down house. Could the kidnappers have gotten scared of the publicity and killed Kimberly to leave no traces? Also in this company was 26-year-old Jose Negrin, who, despite the same last name, was not related to Julio. All the persons involved in the case, having become suspects, turned out to be Joshua's friends. Each of them had dark pages in their past related to criminal episodes. However, these were minor offenses that fade in comparison with the scale of cruelty shown towards Kimberly. It turned out that before the kidnapping, Nicholas Liberty had been released on bail. He was still under police surveillance. On the eve of the massacre of Kimberly, he broke into a friend's house and, under the threat of violence, tried to rob his mother. Instead of the 25-year term that was due for such a crime, he got off with a $1,000 fine, and all thanks to his mother, who hired a good lawyer for her son. Apparently, after that, Nicholas got drunk with impunity, so he decided to carry out a more profitable business, the kidnapping of a businessman's daughter. The police found out that Joshua was the initiator of this crime. It was he who decided that it was possible to kidnap the rich girlfriend of his girl and ask her father for a ransom. The guy controlled Kimberly's movements and anticipated accomplices when she was supposed to return from the party. It turned out that Joshua had a rather turbulent criminal past. From the age of 17, he kidnapped children, but he was quickly caught and arrested. However, because of his young age and the complexity of the case, he received only 5 years. Later, Joshua was arrested for sexual assault on a minor, but he served only 60 days for this. A year later, he was imprisoned again for 18 months, this time for illegal possession of a firearm. It turned out that he and his friends made up a real gang, whose members were called mongrels. Unfortunately, after communicating with the police, the gang leader Joshua disappeared. The police officers decided to talk to Joshua's cohabitant named April. As it turned out, he used his girlfriend as an alibi. The man coordinated the actions of the criminals while at home. In fact, the criminal kidnapped his girlfriend's friend behind her back, but she didn't even suspect it. Thanks to the messages on the pagers and the testimony of the criminals, the police managed to find out their criminal plan in detail. It also became known that they had been following Kimberly at the party. There they behaved calmly, inconspicuously, and just waited for her to go home, and immediately followed her. The 4 kidnappers were identified, but by this time one of the participants in the massacre, Jose, was dead. On July 23rd, 3 months after Kimberly's death, he was attacked on the street when he was walking with a child in his arms. He was shot in the back of the head from behind. No one saw the moment of the massacre, but there were reasons to believe that this was how Joshua made his accomplice shut up. He knew that Jose asked for a threat and wanted to surrender to the police. The remaining 3 were arrested and charged with murder, arson, kidnapping, and holding a person against their will. Later, they managed to talk and put together a complete picture of what happened. In the garage, where they went after the party and waited for Kimberly, the criminals used a gun and duct tape. Kimberly resisted when they pounced on her. She kicked and scratched the attackers, even broke her nails. But the forces were not equal, and she was tied up with duct tape, including her mouth, eyes, and even ears. Then, completely restrained, she was thrown into the trunk. The criminals brought the victim to an abandoned house, took her to the basement, and tied her to a chair. They took off her shoes so that she could not attract attention to herself. They reminded her that her father owed them money, and then left Kimberly here for the next 3 days. The gang leader appointed Julio to go to the house and watch Kimberly, feed her, and give her water. But he was afraid that the police would catch him, so he did not do this. As a result, the girl did not drink or eat. She was very cold and asked for help. Immediately after they brought her to the abandoned house, the enemies reminded Joshua that everything was ready. After that, he made an audio recording in which he demanded $75,000 as a ransom. Joshua called Kim's dad and played this recording for the answering machine, but he did not get into the right time interval, so silence got on the recording. Just in case, Joshua made another call, but in exactly the same way, he made a mistake with the time of turning on the dictaphone demand for ransom. And again, silence was recorded, so no one heard the demands for ransom and did not know that the criminals were waiting for money. Kim never breathed through her taped mouth. She kept losing consciousness, but she was still fighting for her life. Meanwhile, the captors were waiting for news from the victim's father. They did not even realize that he had not received their stories. Instead of checking if everything was going according to plan, they got angry. The criminals never received the ransom, so they decided to let Kimberly go. They came to the basement, but found her with no signs of life. Later, forensic experts found out that everything was not like that. She was simply unconscious due to overloads of the body, cold, lack of food and drink. She was very cold during those days when no one watched over her and fed her. Even before that, they were going to burn the house to cover the tracks. But now the decision was made to burn it along with the hostage in order to hide the tracks. The public called this crime the most brutal in the history of Queens. There were calls for the death penalty, but it was banned in the state. The most controversial figure in the case turned out to be Joshua. He did not take a direct part in the massacre, although he coordinated the actions of other gang members. His girlfriend April testified against him in court. According to her, he personally confessed to her what had happened, and then beat her to make her keep quiet. Then he went on the run, and the police had to resort to a trick to lure out the enemy. For this, they also used April. During interrogation, Joshua mentioned that he did not participate in the massacre of Kim and was not involved in it, and the other participants who were his friends were guilty. When Julio found out about this, he decided to start cooperating with the investigation and told everything. He repeated his words in court, which made it possible to find Joshua guilty on several counts, including murder. He was sentenced to 58 years in prison. Nicholas received the same sentence and was sent to prison for 58 years. Julio, who was found guilty only of complicity, was sentenced to imprisonment for 2 to 6 years. On his daughter's next birthday, which was after the end of the trial, her father Thomas came to the grave to tell Kimberly that he had finally managed to punish the guilty. Kim's father fought the burning loss to the end, but in 2005 he died of cancer. Many remain convinced that the brutal crime undermined the health of the loving father. Nicholas was subjected to harsh treatment and attacks in prison. 2 years after the start of his imprisonment, he died of cancer. Julio served his sentence and was released after 2 years. Joshua will be able to be released only in 2053. Why did Joshua get only 58 years, although he organized such a brutal murder? Perhaps the justice system is too lenient towards such criminals? The story of Kimberly Antonakos is not just another criminal story. This is a tragic and horrifying story about human cruelty and heartlessness that will leave no one indifferent. A young, cheerful girl who had everything for a happy life became a victim of an insidious crime committed by those she trusted the most. Her abduction and horrific death in the flames became a real shock for everyone who knew Kimberly and forever changed the lives of her loved ones. It was especially painful for her loving father, who devoted the rest of his days to the tireless struggle for justice and the punishment of the guilty. This case is not just a story about one crime. It clearly demonstrates how important it is to be careful and cautious, even when it comes to people from our inner circle. It makes us think about whether we can really know those with whom we communicate every day, and whether something dark and sinister is hiding behind welcoming smiles. At the same time, This story shows that even the most difficult and confusing crimes can be solved thanks to the persistent and professional work of investigators, as well as the unbreakable will and determination of the victims' relatives. It proves that the truth, no matter how bitter it may be, will always come to light, and the guilty will be punished. But can we consider that justice has completely triumphed in this story? Is any court verdict capable of compensating for the pain and suffering that Kimberly's loved ones had to endure? Although the perpetrators were sentenced to long terms of imprisonment, nothing can bring the young girl back to life and heal the wounds inflicted on her family. We can only hope that her tragic story will serve as a warning to others, a reminder that life is the highest value, and that we are all responsible for those we let into our lives. Perhaps if we are more attentive to each other, more compassionate and humane, we will be able to prevent similar tragedies in the future. This story leaves no one indifferent. It makes you empathize, be indignant, ask questions about human nature and the justice of the world in which we live. And if it touched you, if you want to learn more about this and other confusing cases, then we invite you to join the community of the Detective Brooks channel. Here you will find many exciting, dramatic, and sometimes shocking stories about the investigation of the most high-profile crimes. Each of these stories is not just a detective plot, but a real human drama that reveals all the complexity and ambiguity of our world. So subscribe to our channel, immerse yourself in the atmosphere of mysteries and investigations, and perhaps together we can make our world at least a little safer and fairer place.